So let's begin lesson 2. Lesson 1 focused on a single species, Chinook salmon. And I think we learned there's a lot of variation even within a species. So in lesson 2, we're going to talk about a group of species, 3 of them, that do things somewhat similar. And we're going to talk about pink salmon, a form of sockeye salmon. What I mean by that is a portion of the species does these types of activities, these types of behaviors, and a form of chum salmon. And we called them, to lump them, is the clean stream team. I hope you enjoy the story. So lesson 2 has been broken up into 4 modules. In module 1, we define why the certain species and forms are put into a grouping called the clean stream team. In module 2, using the upper pit sockeye salmon as an example, we discussed the strategy used for salmon habitat restoration for this population in that watershed. Module 3, we discussed the ecology of pink salmon and describe a pink salmon restoration project in the Squamish River on the Ashley Creek to illustrate the actions taken and the impacts of these restoration efforts on that population. In module 4, we discussed the ecology of chum salmon and used 2 examples of salmon habitat restoration programs targeted at this species. And on the last slide, slide 49, we give a references. References section includes all the digital links that we discuss through the presentation. And for the YouTube version, it's recommended to have a look at the YouTube description, and those links will be placed in the description of this presentation. And hopefully you'll be able to go back, take notes during the presentation on what slides and what you're interested in terms of additional links, and then go to the YouTube description, find that link, and read the article, see the report, or watch the short video. Hope you enjoy lesson 2. Okay, so let's move on from Chinook and talk about this other group of species of salmon that many of us want to help. So to keep this part of our learning journey a little bit simpler, which is good because everything about salmon habitat restoration is really complicated. So let's just make life easier and think in simpler concepts. And the concept I want to use today is the idea of baskets of species that sort of have similar needs and similar tools, can be applied and pulled out of the restoration toolbox to address these needs and try to help them. Now, we've already talked about the Tyee team, but there are a few more. So let's start with species of salmon whose population health is primarily controlled by the amount and quality of stable, clean surface runoff water flows over gravel stream beds that is suitable size for spawning salmon to use. So think about the ideal stream, this gravel bed of the right size that these fish want. The floods aren't too big. The gravel doesn't move too much. The eggs, when they're placed in the gravel, have a reasonable chance to coming out in the spring. That's what we're talking about, this clean stream team. Now, this team does not rear in streams very much. What I mean by that is that when they come out of the gravel, they either move directly to the ocean, or in the case of the sockeye example, they move directly to a lake, which is a still water body like the ocean. So really, the key bit of their habitat we can restore and take action on is really just that spawning ground. So the types of fish again are stream spawning sockeye, pink salmon, chum salmon. And these fish and this is an important part, spawn generally starting as early as August for some of them, maybe as late as mid-October. Most of them are, mid to late September through October, but yes, there's ones in the beginning and the end. So that's their timing. And I'll talk quite a bit later about why the time they spawn means something, tells us something we should consider when we are developing our salmon habitat restoration plan. Okay, so let's begin with some basic salmon biology. So these things are cold-blooded, and their eggs, when they're placed in the gravel, develop quicker in warm water than cold water, cold-blooded. So they take the temperature of the water, and that accelerates their metabolism. So they develop quicker. So all the species of salmon, okay, and I'm going to take an exception of not steelhead, not cutthroat, what we would call trout. They are somewhat different in this regard. Try to get their young fry to develop in the gravel and be ready to leave the gravel by around April Fool's Day, April 1st. So this is sort of an idealized target. You want your little guys to get out of the gravel April 1st. And really what they're trying to do is they're trying to hit spring when things are starting to come alive, food resources are increasing, the ocean ideally is becoming more friendly as the days get longer and warmer. So April Fool's Day is the target. So again, this is idealized because there's slight variations among the different species, but say that these species of fish, their eggs take 1,000 thermal units to develop from an egg they just placed in the gravel to a fry that's ready to swim out of the gravel. 1,000 thermal units. Well, what's a thermal unit? Well, it's a degree for a day. So taking that idea, if the water was 10 degrees Celsius for 100 days, that's 1,000 thermal units. And that'll take that egg to the fry. And you're aiming for April 1st. So when you observe in each individual river, that when a population of salmon spawns, if you see the time they spawn, it will tell you on average what the water temperature is from the fall, winter, and spring. So it might be relatively warm when they spawn, but it might turn really cold midwinter just because that water comes out from the mountain streams or something else that makes it very, very cold. And maybe it's in a dark north-facing valley so it doesn't warm up in the spring. So if you see a salmon spawning in August, it tells you that that stream is colder on average than if you see the same species spawning in another stream in mid-November. That stream is much warmer on average because remember, they're cold-blooded. They can only develop as fast as the water temperature, and they're all planning to come out on April Fool's Day. So again, mountain-fed streams with lots of high snowfields and glaciers tend to be colder than streams flowing out of lakes, particularly large lakes. So large lakes, think of it like a battery. The summer heat is stored deep in that lake, and that water is released all through the winter, and it's much warmer than the water coming off the mountains. So anything below a large lake often will spawn much later than a mountain-fed stream, particularly a smaller stream that gets very, very cold in the winter. So, good example, we use the Upper Pit River Chinook that we talked about. They're early timing spawners. They'll be spawning in August, September. And you remember the Upper Pit was a mountain stream that came through the mountains. It was high snowfields and glaciers. It was what would be classed as a cold water stream. And compare that to the good old Harrison River, which spawn downstream of the really big Harrison Lake. Now they don't spawn till October, November. So the Pit River are called early timing spawners, and the Harrison are called October, November, often are called middle timing spawners. Simple. But it's important because these observations gives you a hint what restoration tools you may apply to help the population. So the clean stream team are pink salmon of all timings, early, mid, and late. Chums, only those in early and mid timing, chum salmon. Sockeye, early and mid timing. And they represent the colder stream bunch. And effectively they represent streams that are surface water fed. What I mean by that, they either come out of a lake or off a mountain stream. I'll talk later about other types of water supplies, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So we will use different restoration strategies for them because of this. The clean stream team. What sets apart this group of salmon populations is they are critically reliant on the stability and quality of water flows in surface runoff streams, more so than other salmon. So if there's a big flood, these guys' eggs are right in the middle of it and can get scoured out as the gravel moves and they die. If a big chunk of silt falls off the stream bank in that flood and goos up the stream bed, the eggs suffocate in the reds and die. This group takes chances by spawning right in the middle of the stream and can die if things are not going well in the climate that winter. So in the case of the clean stream team, the fry from this group, when they emerge from the gravel, generally move very quickly to open water rearing areas in the ocean, pink and chum particularly, or in the lake, sockeye. So to get a large and healthy population size of these groups, the quality and quantity of the spawning ground controls these populations. It's the spawning ground. So if you improve or restore the amount of stable, high-quality spawning areas for these three species, and their populations can grow to almost, I don't want to say it, but unlimited size, very large sizes. That's pink and chum. Now there is an exception, that's sockeye, which are somewhat limited by their mini ocean. They go to the lake, and those lakes do have capacity, but generally there's a lot of capacity in lakes. So they're going to live there for a few years before they go to the ocean. But generally speaking, it's the spawning grounds that dictate how big the populations can get. So this group of species and this form of those species have placed their bets on the ocean, strongly on the ocean, and much less on the streams than have other species like coho, chinook, steelhead, and trout, various trout salmon. And this then focuses what we do when developing salmon habitat restoration projects targeted at the clean stream team species. So as we discussed, these three species spend much of their life in the ocean. And it's probably for this reason that they make up the vast majority of salmon in the North Pacific Ocean. Up to 85% of the salmon in the ocean by some calculations, with pink salmon being the most abundant, about 60%, sockeye 15%, and chum salmon being about 10% of the salmon in the North Pacific Ocean. So the clean stream team spends less of their lives in streams, which are sort of dangerous places, especially around us, where we have created impacts to make them even more dangerous, more unstable. And they spend more of their lives in the ocean, peaceful and quiet most of the time. So if you want to think about it, would you rather spend time here or here? So again, the clean stream team. So two of the species, pink and chum, also prefer to spawn downstream of lakes. And some do spawn upstream of lakes, but mainly the populations, the bigger populations anyway, are downstream of lakes. And they do not like to pass through the lakes, probably because there's just too many big fish that like to eat the little pink and chum fry. which are just really trying to get out of Dodge and get down to the ocean and really don't want to hang around these lakes as rearing areas. So this is the absolute opposite of what sockeye salmon prefer, who choose streams to spawn in generally above lakes. Of course, there's always exceptions. There's never an absolute rule when it comes to this sort of salmon ecology, but generally they like to spawn on streams above lakes. So their little fry, they just have to come out of the gravel. They could probably lay on their back and flow down with the stream flow into the lake. So they want to be in that lake to live and grow for a year or two before heading to the ocean. So their strategy is get above the lake, float down to the lake, live in the lake, and become a much larger smolt before they have to face that long migration, dodging predators. And if you're bigger, you're just harder to catch. It's simple. So in this way, pink, sockeye, and chum somewhat separate themselves on the spawning ground, so they're not fighting each other for red sites and are not digging each other's eggs out of the gravel when they are trying to spawn. Remember what I said, when they get a productive spawning area, because their population is very much ocean focused or lake focused in terms of sockeye, they can have very mass spawning events, just a lot of fish in one spot. So you take the three species, and if they're all trying to get out on April 1st, they're all going to show up in the same patch of gravel, and it's not going to end well for some of them. Generally, the bigger bodied fish overwhelm the smaller bodied fish and push them off the spawning grounds. So we'll talk a bit more about that. So let's talk a little bit about the list of techniques identified in the Fish Rehabilitative Procedure Toolbox. So knowing this ecology for this group, only a few of them can be actually applied productively to these three species. Fish access, particularly spawning habitat rehabilitation, section 5, page 8. Yes, stream banks, restoring stream banks, probably not that important. Large wood debris, probably not that important. Boulder clusters, not really important. Pool riffle construction, maybe, probably the riffle part. Fertilization, not so much for the stream, but maybe for that sockeye lake, maybe, but only for the sockeye, not for pink and chum. And off channel, yes, for certain types of off channel, side channels, flowing channels connected to the main river for all these three species. So again, the toolbox cannot be applied across the board for all species, all forms, but this is a description what the tools you have to focus on. So if you want to truly help these three species, you really only have a few salmon habitat restoration techniques you can apply. Now, how you apply them will depend on which particular watershed and which particular population you are working with on the project. So it's complicated, again. So here's a general rule. Don't really like general rules, but we'll go for it. As a general rule, pinks like to spawn in somewhat less stable rivers than chum salmon. This is generally not well documented in the literature, but this is from just observation. So some people think this is because pinks, when we have looked at studies, a little pink fry going to the ocean for unknown reasons will survive at a higher rate than a little chum fry. They don't know why that is. They think because the pinks has evolved more specialized habits focused on ocean life. So they survive a little better. So that means a pink salmon, if the goal is to produce 2 fish back from that red, so your population survives. So if you put 2,000 eggs in a slightly poor quality spawning ground, there's lots of it, lots of area, but maybe the flood frequency is a little higher. There's a flood more often and gravel moves a little bit more. So if you put 2,000 pink eggs in that gravel and 2,000 chum eggs, and they went to sea. They survived the same amount. Let's say it's not that great in the river. They go to the ocean. 2 pinks come back, but only 1.5 chums come back. The pinks are stable, but the chums are starting to decline and will slowly disappear unless they get higher survival. So again, it looks like the ecology is the pinks are able to use poor quality spawning grounds and not compete with another species. So, and why is that important? Well, if you find pinks and chums on the same spawning grounds, and you do find that in many streams in our area, and Alouette River is one of them, one of those species tends to dominate. And if it's chum, like in the Alouette River, chums are just much bigger than a pink salmon, maybe twice as big by weight. So because they're so big and they're both spawning at the same time, they can dominate the spawning ground. If the spawning ground is full and there's pinks and chums, you can guarantee the chums get their spot first and the pinks have to get what's left over. So size does matter. So in certain rivers where pinks dominated, chums are in the minority, probably because of the quality of the spawning ground is not high enough to sustain their population. When chums dominate, the quality is high enough to sustain their population and would be high enough to sustain pinks, but there's just too many damn chums that are pushing them off that gravel. So again, back to this story, sockeye are segregating somewhat by going above the lake. Pink and chums don't like to go there, so they don't have to compete with pink and chums. Pink and chums segregate. Pinks take the poor quality stuff. There might be lots of it, so their population can get huge in some rivers, but not so many chums because they can't sustain the flood frequency, let's say. And some rivers, the chums absolutely dominate in huge numbers, and the pinks are there, but a minor player because they really can't deal with the chums competing for spawning gravel. It's the beauty of ecology. These species have evolved together, and they've evolved tools to survive in the world and segregate somewhat so they all survive. It's a lesson we should think about. So I've been talking in sort of general statements, sort of conceptual statements about the differences of species. So let's get back to some specifics. And we'll go back to a couple of rivers we have previously visited and look at how 2 projects for these clean stream team species and see how they are similar and how they are different. So the first stream is the Upper Pitt River, which we know from our previous discussion is very unstable with lots of gravel moving during the fall-winter floods. So all the salmon in the Upper Pitt have to find places away from these floods to spawn. So interesting, the Upper Pitt River is above a lake. So we're talking about sockeye. We're not talking about pinks or chums. They do exist in the watersheds, but in extremely low numbers. This stream is dominated on the spawning grounds by sockeye salmon. It's above a lake. So we previously used the Upper Pitt River to talk about Chinook salmon. So we know the Chinook salmon have found Little Blue Creek, but it is 30 kilometers upstream from Pitt Lake, which appears to be a little too far for the little sockeye fry to swim down to the lake from the spawning grounds because there's so many big trout and char waiting for them in the main river to eat them. Okay, so visualize you're a sockeye adult, you want to put your eggs in the gravel in a stable location, give them a fighting chance to survive the floods. And when they come out of the river in the spring, the river is low and clear. And if you know the Upper Pitt River, it's actually a trophy fishery for bull trout. It's a form of char. We haven't talked about it. Bull trout possibly Dolly Varden. They're very similar. They're related to Arctic char in the north, but they're major predators on salmon fry in the spring. So you're a little sockeye fry, you come out of the gravel. Ideally, you're migrating between 10 o'clock at night and 2 in the morning when it's dark, and you come out of the gravel and you want to hit the lake. The problem is, the farther you go up Upper Pitt River, the likelihood you're not going to be able to do it in one night. And you're going to either have to hide during the day and try another night, but the farther upstream you go, the more likely you're going to be eaten. So that little blue creek that worked for the Chinook, they don't have to migrate to the lake right away. They rear slowly and come down the river slowly. And they're much bigger when they finally get to the bottom, and they can avoid these big mouths and the char and the trout. But the little sockeye fry are sort of stuck with this. So what we find is the sockeye that spawn in the Upper Pitt River don't go to Blue Creek, maybe a handful, but the vast majority are probably less than 20K, probably less than 15K up from the lake. And they're looking for stable areas, either tributary streams, we'll talk about one, Corbould Creek, and possibly Boise Creek that I've mentioned, I think, before. But they're also looking for these little side channels of the main river that might be made more stable because they're hard on the edge of the river against the mountain, and often there's a log jam at the top end which slows the flood water. So they're looking for these sorts of sites. And unfortunately, the Upper Pitt, due to its natural history and the heavy logging of the watershed, these sites are very rare, and that opens an opportunity for the salmon habitat restoration team to recreate or create stable side channel habitat for use by spawning sockeye salmon. So I got a little ahead of myself in the last slide. So this is a summary of what I've said. So the Upper Pitt sockeye don't spawn too far up from the lake. They're looking for these quiet side channels and back channels that are somewhat protected from the floods. The valley has been logged, and there's built roads all over the place to move the timber to the market. So as we talked even previous, roads and logging tends to make the streams and gravel more unstable. So the Upper Pitt has never been a stable stream, but it's not getting better. It's getting worse. So these side streams, Corbould Creek I mentioned, they have some other issues that when they come from the side hill, these logging roads, they have to go under the logging roads. Well, these streams like to move around. Well, it's a hard thing when you build a logging bridge to have the creek move, so they often have a dike built from the valley side to get that stream, in this case Corbould Creek, under that logging bridge. So again, that's part of the story of the salmon habitat restoration project we undertook on the Pitt. So since these protected side channels are so rare, the Upper Pitt sockeye have been in trouble for a number of decades. Remember, this area has been logged probably not quite 100 years, but getting pretty close. And it continues to be heavily logged today. So the very first salmon habitat restoration project directed at sockeye salmon was begun in 1996. And it worked well enough that a second wave of work has been started in 2020 and continues, and we're going to talk about that. So the project known as Quatstacktuck channels look at the sockeye salmon in the Halkomelem Salish language. It is a project that restores a series of protected side channels specifically designed for sockeye salmon by placing pipes which replace what I described in nature, the log jams at the head of side channels. We use pipes to reduce the flow in floods. But in this case, the pipes go through that riverside dike beside the stream, in this case, Corbould Creek. The dike was constructed originally to keep the river under the logging bridge. So the pipe through the dike feeds the water back onto the floodplain into these old historic side channels, which then are cleaned up, the gravel exposed, and here is their story. Before we talk about that, look at the Sockeye Channel project, let's talk a little bit more about Corbould Creek itself. It is almost a perfect spawning stream for sockeye in the Upper Pitt River watershed. clean gravel, just the right size for sockeye salmon to spawn in, and it is less than 10 kilometers from Pitt Lake, an easy night's swim for those fast migrating little sockeye fry trying to avoid being eaten. Strong late summer flows fed from high elevation snowfields and glaciers give the adult sockeye lots of flow over the gravel bars during their spawning timing of late August through late September and make it really hard for the bears to get an easy meal. Almost perfect. Oh, yeah, I said almost. The problem being, as this river is already naturally unstable, it's been made more unstable due to extensive logging throughout the watershed and is confined by dikes at its lower end, which concentrate the floodwaters when they come to one single channel. And this can be a problem. So when the really big floods do occur every few years or so, if you were a sockeye that enjoyed spawning under the logging bridge in Lower Cobalt Creek, your eggs would be goners during that big flood, as all the gravel bed would be moving during the peak flows. So, what to do? The message for the population's persistence and resilience is always tell some of your relations to spawn in some of the more protected side channels, just as insurance against these bad flood years, like the Alvin Patterson channel. Because in bad flood years, that is the place to be. Population collapse is a very bad word and should be avoided at all costs. So I think you'll find I sort of like this picture. You'll see it pop up throughout this story on salmon habitat restoration. It's what's called a rain-on-snow event flood. So imagine you have new snow on the hills in November, then you get 3 hard continuous days of that warm tropical rain, what we call on the West Coast the Pineapple Express. And if you were that little sockeye salmon that had spawned under that quiet, peaceful bridge in August, and you're in a red under that turbid water, that gravel is moving and you are gone. So it's just a reminder that the habitat in the main stem is the backbone of sockeye salmon production in the Upper Pitt River. However, it's the refuge habitat areas that sustain the run in these difficult years when we get these large rain-on-snow events. So this is just a conceptual sketch of what this side channel project is going to be all about. It's on the old Cobalt Creek floodplain that was diked off many years ago. If you see the little channel in green, I think it's about 1.2 kilometers long, so it's not a small channel. That was the one that was built in 1996 and is known as Alvin Patterson Channel. But if you look at the channels in blue and yellow, they're the ones being constructed as we speak and will be constructed over the following years. And they're all targeted at creating this stable habitat for sockeye salmon to tuck into away from the Pitt River, which you see on the left, to give them a place to have a core population. On a good year, the Upper Pitt has many places that the eggs survive, but on a bad flood year, it is a really bad place to put a salmon egg nest. So in a flood year, these protected areas will keep a portion of the population protected. So instead of collapsing after a flood year, the population will go down, but it won't collapse. And that means it will recover quicker. What makes it more resilient for just if flood frequency increases under some of the climate change predictions, then these areas will become more and more critical just to keep that population stable enough to recover from periods of bad climate events. So that's the idea. This is that Sockeye project on the Upper Pitt, and I'll show you some pictures on how these things are built and what they look like. So this is just installing what we call the river intake. So behind the machine, you'll see the floodplain of the Cobalt Creek. the water in the foreground. But you'll notice it's a very broad floodplain, lots of exposed gravel. Corbould Creek itself is highly disturbed, heavy logging in its watershed. In a flood, you don't want to be anywhere near Corbould Creek. So these pipes are meant to protrude out into the water and take water under the dike and release it in a controlled manner on the land side of the dike where these side channels have been restored. So again, it effectively provides a stable habitat in a highly unstable area. So this is just another shot of the intakes now installed in the stream. They're simple pipes. They have a slot in the back and they sit just off the stream bed. So the gravel moving along the stream bed in the flood isn't easily captured in the pipe. It's set off the bottom for a reason. Again, when you have a flood, you can imagine the gravel bar in the background is fully underwater. So all the large logs and the wood in the flood are actually quite a bit above these intakes, so they don't capture a lot of wood debris. They're a very simple intake that's taken a couple decades to perfect, but they provide a very secure and stable water supply from really unstable streams like Corbould Creek. Here's a view of those river intakes that I just showed you, pulled up on the bank. Now we call them wing intakes. They were developed specifically for restoration side channels in places that often don't have a lot of people. They have to take care of themselves in low water and in high water. So following that little blue line, you can see the water will be passing from left to right. It'll flow over the front of the pipe intake, which is solid. And then what is the wing is actually a series of bars. There's gaps between the bars, maybe 10 centimeter gaps between the bars. So if you're a particle of water, you flow over the intake and then you make a turn and you go through the bars into the back of the pipe where there's a slot. So that's the way the water gets in. But you can imagine in a flood when the gravel is banging along the bottom and bouncing around in the stream bed, and this wing is set up off the stream bed, perhaps 0.3 of a meter, a foot. That gravel may bounce over top of the intake, but because of its momentum, it's likely not going to make a U-turn to get into the intake. So this intake provides a lot cleaner water supply to the side channel, which is at the other end of the pipe. Same thing with woody debris. Woody debris hits the smooth leading edge of the wing, bounces off, and keeps floating. There's not a lot of suction on the rack, particularly during a flood, so it keeps very, very clean. Again, it's meant to be operated in remote sites. Keep that water running 365 days a year, 24 hours a day without a human hand touching it. That's the ideal. And it took a few years to develop this design, but it works very, very well. Wing intake. So a point of clarification why these intakes are designed to exclude gravel entering the pipeline. If you can imagine during a large flood event, the water depth over this pipeline would be much deeper, and there'd be a lot of energy driving the water through the pipeline. Any gravels moving in the flood that was entrained in the entrance of that pipeline would move very quickly through the pipeline and deposit at the head of the channel. So over time, after a series of floods, the channel bottom would slowly get higher and higher and higher. The only thing that can really move gravel in those side channels, those protected side channels, are the spawning of fish. So if more gravel was coming in, then the fish could move downstream each year. At some point, the bed of the upper end of the side channel might become high enough that when low water came in, let's say Corbould Creek in January when everything was frozen up, the water level in Corbould could actually be slightly lower than that gravel bed that had built up over time, and that could be a problem. Now we do design around that. In most projects, there'll be a large pool constructed below the intake pipe discharge. So any gravel moving through the pipe will end up in the pool, and we have access to that pool to clean it out, to dig it out every so often. But the reality is we want to keep maintenance to the absolute minimum. Ideally, we'd only have to dig it out once every 10 years or 20 years. So if it was an open pipe, it might be once every 5 years. With this sort of intake, we might be able to push that maintenance off for 20 years. Again, it's a good intake for excluding gravel for those reasons. So most of us get to see salmon habitat restoration projects after they're built and are functioning. A lot of us don't really get to see the nuts and bolts of how they are built. And all I can say is they're built by very creative and pragmatic people. So in this case, in the Upper Pitt River, they were short one length of pipe. It was needed to extend a pipe farther than the design called for. So the original pipeline was hauled up by a barge, but they were missing that one special piece. So, like all creative work groups, they put their heads together and came up with a rather novel plan. And off they went along Pitt Lake, on their way to the Upper Pitt River. So after those planes, trains, and automobiles, that single length of pipe was bolted on to the other parts of the intake. The valves replaced, the dike was backfilled, and as I said, most of us show up after all the work is done. So it's just a little reminder, all the details that take to make these things work. A lot of it is hidden from view.
Nice new spawning channel, running about 50 CFS right now, about a foot deep, 3 to 4 feet per second. Beauty.
So this is just a little video clip of the Alvin Patterson channel, the 1996 channel when it's flowing. Notice the color of the water, it's slightly glacial. It's moving at a pretty good clip. It's got a bit of depth, deeper than a sockeye body. So if you're a sockeye salmon, you have a reasonable chance to be spawning and get those eggs in the gravel before our furry friends chase you down. So again, this is why the valves are turned up during spawning ground. And later, when the fish have completed spawning, the flows are dropped to maybe half this amount. And what that means is a lot less silt comes in during the flood season. So the flow is reduced to keep the eggs wet and happy, and the flow is increased to keep the adults happy. So that's how this channel is managed through the season. It requires human intervention. We have the Pitt River Lodge folks in the watershed that really care about salmon that have helped with this valve setting, and Catesy First Nation have technicians in the valley on a regular basis. They're the long-term operators of this project. So the people component, the ecology component, the physical design component, and you mix it all together into a very effective salmon habitat project. As Jonathan Bulcock, senior engineering technician with Fisheries and Oceans, would say, as he led the restoration of the Alvin Patterson channel, if we build it, they will come. So when the Sockeye channel is completed, in probably in the next 3 or 4 years, and if we're lucky, around 2030, this project could support up to 20,000 spawning sockeye. So by that year, it will truly live up to its name. Look at the sockeye salmon. So to summarize, this is a form of off-channel restoration, side channel restoration, flowing side channel restoration. It's a technique that we have used in the Upper Pitt for this form of sockeye. It would be appropriate in some rivers for certain forms of chum, but definitely in virtually all rivers for pink salmon. This is the type of habitat that pink salmon would seek out. Now, the upper Pitt River is above the lake. And as you recall, pink salmon and chum salmon do not typically go above lakes in any great numbers, and that's the case in the upper Pitt. There's been rumors of the odd pink in the watershed, and there's a small population of chums, but they're very rare. Sockeye dominate above the lake. So this population, again, spawns late August, early September. So again, from our previous discussion, these are mountain runoff streams. This is what would be called an early spawning sockeye population. And therefore, river intake type side channel is exactly the technique that was suggested to help these fish in an basically unstable watershed. So if you want to read a bit more on surface fed channel in the fish habitat rehabilitation procedures, it's in section 7, I think pages 6 to 20. There's the link. Have a read and think about what you've seen today about the upper Pitt sockeye channel. So this project is a good way to illustrate the various components needed to deliver an effective restoration project. So know the biology of the species and population you are trying to assist. And then try to mirror the habitat that they want and that need to thrive. So that's an observational thing. Where are they spawning now? Where are they surviving now? What's the nature of the habitat? And try to mirror that. So in this case, stable flowing side channel habitat or tributary habitat with clean gravel, attractive in size to spawning sockeye salmon. That was the recipe suggested from observations. So if you can provide that type of relatively rare habitat, it's clear the sockeye spawners will seek out this habitat if you provide it to them and do the rest. So your job is to make sure it keeps providing a stable place for spawning sockeye in this generally unstable watershed for as many decades as you can. So that's partly by design. This particular site is behind a riverside dike that was created to protect a logging bridge. Now the logging bridge is the main line of this valley. It will be maintained for many, many years ahead. So the dike will likely be maintained by others for many years ahead. So the dike had impacts when it was built. It reduced the floodplain of Corbould Creek, which is a bad thing. But right now that dike is providing flood protection to the restored side channels behind it. So you're taking something that was a negative and you're turning it to your advantage. Also, the channel is tight to the valley side of the valley. It's away from the active channel of the upper Pitt. It is highly unlikely the upper Pitt in any reasonable time frame will come and erode away these areas. That's the second thing. The third thing is, as you know, anything with a pipe and a valve requires a human component, but the design does not require any change in valve setting to make it function. One annual valve setting will make it function better, but it still would function if the valve was set year-round and never touched. As I discussed, the intake itself in the river is designed to be hands-free, not require maintenance. So everything has been done to make this as low a maintenance a habitat as practical, but there's good access. There's a trail and a road access to the channel. It's near the mainline logging road, so it actually can be observed literally from a truck driving up the mainline logging road, which is important for maintenance. If you're looking for log debris that have fallen from storms that may deny fish access, you want to know about it before the fish come back. So again, because this valley is somewhat remote, we have to have thought about keeping this as low operational requirements as possible, but we do have advocates in the valley. That includes, as I've said, the KC First Nations have technical people coming into the valley periodically, and the Pitt River Lodge is very keen supporters of salmon and have been very helpful on operational requirements of this habitat. So the message here is to deliver a successful project, you need a range of steady partners with a whole range of skills and resources. from technical just for being on the ground in the watershed. So in this case, the lead organizer of all the activities of the Salmon Habitat Restoration Project, this one we've just highlighted, is the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, an organization based in First Nations in the Lower Fraser River, who have an intimate relationship with salmon, and a very personal interest in salmon. And they're also well connected to the many restoration groups throughout the Lower Fraser. So they took the lead in bringing all the other parties into delivering this project. So the two other key partners in this project, they bring a wealth of local knowledge. And they're, as I've mentioned, Casey First Nation, who has a time immemorial relationship to this watershed. And the Pitt River Lodge, which operates a business for anglers and just nature watchers and enjoyers that come into the valley and stay at the lodge. They're fully committed to assist in salmon habitat restoration in the Upper Pitt River. What they know about the sockeye, where they spawn, and the watershed in general is invaluable to the team because they spend days and days and months on the ground observing how this system works. So another key group is Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Resource Restoration Unit. This is a part of the Salmon Enhancer Program. And they're a bunch of skilled professionals, engineers, biologists, and technicians, engineering technicians that bring the skills needed to design and build the actual physical works, and which then create a successful spawning habitat. Now they need to work closely with a master heavy-duty equipment operator. In this case, there's a fellow named Rod Bollinger that did the 2020 and 2021 work. Again, a skilled operator that is used to operating in this remote valley, and this is a huge benefit when you're trying to build something unique in somewhat challenging situation. Professional skills, fisheries and oceans, local construction skills, Rod Bollinger delivered a heck of a good project in 2020 and 2021. Now lastly, there are the funders of the work. These are the groups that seek out or directly provide funds to do the work. So in this case, the partnership, the key players were World Wildlife Fund that provided some funds and accumulated other funds, and the Pacific Salmon Foundation provided some of the fundings. So these were the largest sources of monies to get this project built. So at the end of the day, developing a successful salmon habitat restoration project involves a lot of thinking, thoughtful discussion, lots of planning, a whole lot of very specialized skills held by a bunch of people. And getting back to money, without money, nothing happens. So these funding partners are critically important as part of the team. So the final message, basically, strong partnerships generally deliver strong projects. And this has always been the rule rather than the exception. Simple. So as we discussed previously, pink salmon are the most abundant pink salmon in the North Pacific Ocean. But for this reason, they're often the most neglected because we just assume they always will be so. So what we've discovered, particularly in the developed South in our area, that these most abundant salmon are also the most vulnerable to being driven to extinction in their home rivers. And this is because every pink salmon you see, every adult is 2 years old. Now this is different than all the other species. You'll see coho that are 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, Chinooks that are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, chums 3, 4, 5, 6, those sorts of things. So what it means is when a fish spawns, its progeny will come back in multiple years. So if there's a bad year in the ocean, or if there's a bad year in the river, there's another group of fish that will fill in that bad year from another spawn year. Pink salmon, that's not the case. So when you see a pink salmon in the fall and it dies off, there's no more adult pink salmon left in the world from that population. They're all eggs deposited in the gravel. And if you get a big flood and those eggs are lost, then that run is gone. Now this is rather strange in my world. It seems like a rather odd strategy in this such unstable landscape that they exist in. Now, even more odd things about pinks, you may have heard an odd number pink year. Well, it means that salmon in 2021 spawned in 2019. They're progeny of. And then they'll return in 2023. You notice they're every odd year. Interestingly enough, there's populations of pink salmon that occur in even years. 2020, 2022, 2024. Even and odd pink salmon never mix. They're two almost separate species because of the inflexible 2-year life cycle. Again, very strange. No one really knows why this has occurred. They think it's something to do during the glacial period. Certain populations did evolve different years. All I know is even year pinks are more common in the north and odd year pinks are more common in the south, and there's sort of a middle ground where you get both runs. In northern Georgia Strait, you get even year pink runs and odd year pink runs. Right around Howe Sound, we only have odd numbered pink salmon runs, and the same is true for the Fraser River. There is no even year pinks in the Fraser River, just the odd stray from maybe farther north, but generally odd numbered pinks. So the other thing that is interesting about pink salmon is I spent a lot of time talking about conservation units with Chinook salmon. So often a single run of Chinook salmon is a conservation unit, as we described on the Harrison, Mariah Slough, and Upper Pit. Pinks are different. They have very large conservation units that include hundreds of populations, and it's likely this is a result that pink salmon periodically have been lost in their home watershed, and the neighboring population on a really good ocean year when there's just a lot of pink salmon, they wander next door and begin the run again. Now it may take a very short time if pinks are really abundant, but as we've learned here in our area, when pinks are depressed and there's not a lot of pink salmon around, when you lose pink salmon in your watershed, you don't get them back in a hurry. Sometimes decades they have not come back. But anyway, the conservation units are very large, which is part of their natural biology, which means we can intervene and bring a pink salmon population from the neighboring stream and keep it within the same conservation unit, which means they're similar enough that they should be able to sustain a population in a new river from a neighboring population. And we'll talk more about that in where we have actually done that. So what happened in Squamish in the 50s and 60s, we basically lost all our pink salmon runs to the smaller streams. And the only runs that really sustain themselves are on the big rivers that were big, healthy, and somewhat stable. That's the Fraser River, the Harrison River, and to a certain degree the Chilliwack River. Effectively, all the smaller runs, particularly below Mission Bridge, where there was an intense gillnet fishery in the fall every year, went extinct in the 50s. They just disappeared. And it was overharvest in those commercial fisheries and coincidentally aggressive logging of their watersheds, and to a certain degree in some of the more urban streams, yes, urban development and development of the lands along those streams. They all conspired. Pinks were gone below Mission Bridge and the Fraser River and its tributaries by the 1950s. So some other points to consider about are this littlest of the salmon, the smallest bodied salmon. is effectively they get pushed around on the spawning grounds. If they're on spawning grounds, they tend to take less desirable spawning areas, and it's effectively, I believe, and some believe, it's to get away from competing for spawning beds with the larger salmon cousins, particularly chum salmon. So what they do is they tend to choose sites in big rivers out in the main flow that are more vulnerable to flooding, and their gravel nests therefore are more prone to being washed downstream. So when unchecked clear-cut logging early on of our watersheds occurred, they were already taking risks in the main parts of the channels and protected side channels, but the main parts of the channels more so than the other species. So when the rivers destabilized after clear-cut logging, it was very bad for pink salmon. So the Fraser River supports the largest pink salmon runs in BC. And if you think about it being such a large watershed, you could have heavy rain events, but only in a very small portion of the watershed in the fall and winter. Most of the upper watershed is in heavy snow cover and does not have large floods during the winter. So the Fraser River mainstem is actually very stable during the winter months, and that's why it supports the largest pink salmon run in BC. Fortunately, unfortunately, these fish were targeted for commercial fishery every 2 years, and the intensity of the fishery was driven how many pinks were coming back to the Fraser River. But what this meant is all the little streams around Georgia Strait and the lower Fraser River, which had suffered these impacts of post-war logging and land development, were mixed in with the stronger pink salmon runs and were fished all together in the main fishing area. So the dual impacts of land development on these little watersheds that made them much more unstable in the main spawning grounds that pinks used. One strike, and strike two was Fraser River was doing pretty good for pink salmon, and they fished them very hard. Strike three, strike two, and strike three, basically by 1970, virtually all the little streams of the lower Georgia Strait and lower Fraser had lost their pink salmon. And that's where our story begins about salmon habitat restoration team. What should we do? So what do you do exactly when you don't have any pinks left in a stream? How do you restore them? So I'm going to describe a watershed where this, in fact, occurred. The population collapsed in the 60s, didn't recover in the 70s, and an effort was made in the 80s to get the run going. So generally, the only way is to find the nearest surviving pink population in a nearby stream. In the Squamish River, that was the Indian River, the closest stream we could find that had a healthy pink population. Take those eggs in the Indian River, bring them to the Squamish, plant them into a safe location, whether it's a hatchery or a protected channel, and release them and try to initiate a run. So, second, because one of the reasons, or the primary reasons they went extinct in the first place, is their home rivers have been made more unstable, in this case by logging. Which means that during large floods, the whole river, the gravel bed is mobile, the river is very unstable, the banks have been destabilized, they're young forests, all those issues related to logging roads start to collapse in big storms. So it's very, very hard on this species of salmon. So there was a very large flood, I think, in the 1975 that effectively finished off the Squamish River pink salmon. So what do? Well, you provide protected side channels, as we described for the Upper Pitt River and Sockeye salmon. The same designs and techniques are used for pink salmon, these types of rivers. And it was done in a number of sites in the Squamish River. One of them was the Little Ashlew side channel, which I'm going to show you a picture of very quickly, and a bunch of happy pinks spawning in it. So is there any difference between a sockeye channel and a pink channel? Not much. The gravel might be a little smaller. They're a smaller bodied fish. And the message, though, these pink salmon Often when they're abundant, people seem to take them for granted. You go to the north, very abundant pink salmon runs up in Alaska. I have actually heard the comment they've been called creek maggots, and that says a lot. I live down here, and we missed our pink salmon. We missed them for, well, in the Coquitlam River, they disappeared in 1957, the year after I was born, and I did not see a pink salmon until we and a group of individuals and groups collaborated to bring them back around 1993 by bringing them in with a small hatchery program. 40 years they disappeared. When the first pink salmon came back, they were like gold. Anyway, we miss them when they're gone. We don't want them to go, so we're going to try very hard to come up with ways to keep them around. Protected side channels is one technique we've used. Conservation hatcheries is another technique we've used when necessary. So we'll talk a little bit more in a minute. Okay, let's talk about a Squamish River example, pink salmon habitat restoration project that is a virtual twin of the Upper Pitt River Sockeye channels. Same channels, same technique, different species. So this pink story begins in the high mountain-bound watershed of the Squamish River at the head of Howe Sound. The difference is it doesn't have a lake downstream as the Upper Pitt example. It has Howe Sound, which is just part of that big blue sea. This is pink salmon country. Just like Upper Pitt was sockeye salmon country because of the presence of the lake. The Habitat Restoration Project is located on the lower Ashley Creek, which is a tributary of the Squamish River, again very similar to Corbould Creek in the Upper Pitt. So both Corbould Creek and Ashley Creek share a really common story in terms of what was happening in their watershed when it was happening. So it was about large-scale logging of their watersheds throughout the 20th century. Okay, as I said, the Ashley Creek watershed story is very similar to what happened on Corbould Creek in the Upper Pitt River. So Ashley Creek was first hand logged in its lower reaches by the 1940s. So the accessible timber in the lower end was done quite early. But it wasn't until the 1960s a logging road was placed into the valley and industrial scale logging began. So Ashley Creek, it has a large and extensive watershed, but as it moves toward its lower end, it goes through a very confined canyon just before it's a confluence with the Squamish River, and this canyon is actually impassable to salmon. So just the very lower section of Ashley Creek, as it exits its canyon, bursts out onto a broad floodplain, and then it enters the Squamish. So this means only 3.2 kilometers of quite a large stream, the Ashley Creek, is actually accessible to salmon. So it's really, really important habitat for salmon, just that lower end. And of course, across this broad floodplain had to be crossed by this new logging road on its way to the headwaters of Ashley Creek. So to get through this lower floodplain tangle of forest, wetland, and a major side channel used by all the salmon in the stream, known locally as the Little Ashley, the road just had to push the river out of the way. So up where the river burst out of its canyon, the new road had to cross to the far side of the stream and had to construct a series of 2 bridges. Well, at this point, a dike was constructed on the left bank looking downstream for a number of meters, hundreds of meters, that effectively diked off approximately half of this productive floodplain, also known as the Ashley Flats, which included the Little Ashley side channel, which then remained dry from the 1960s for the next 30 years. And so this is where our little pink story, our little habitat restoration program for pink salmon story begins about the little Ashlew recovery. So the beginning of the Little Ashlew Habitat Restoration Program was initiated by the beginning of a new program in BC called BC Forest Renewal. And there was a portion of that program called the Watershed Restoration Program. Now it began around 1995, and the intent was to restore salmon habitats damaged by past logging practices in BC. The Forest Practices Code had been upgraded at the same time that was intended to reduce damage to salmon habitat in the future. But this program was meant to try to take care of past impacts best they could. So the Squamish River was actually being used as a demonstration watershed just to try to show people and experiment with projects what might be done to reverse some of these historic forest impacts to salmon. So you can imagine the Ashlew Creek was a star target for this program because of its long history of logging and significant impacts on salmon. So part of that discussion, again, people talking to people, there was a longtime Fisheries and Ocean Salmon Enhancement Program technician known as Bob Brown. And he pointed his finger at this dry little Ashlew side channel, which was full of young alders. It had not flown for 30 years. It was being reclaimed by the forest, but there was patches of gravel and obvious channel forms in the Ashlew Flats. And he simply said to the accumulated groups of professionals trying to look at the whole watershed, the Squamish watershed, and said, well, when I started working for the department in the 1960s, the Ashlew Flat was alive with Chinook, pink, and coho salmon, particularly that little Ashlew. We should fix that. So a team was formed, and they did. So starting in 1997, a partnership between the BC Watershed Restoration Program, the Steelhead Society of BC, Interfor Logging Company, and the DFO Salmon Enhancement Program began work on the Little Ashlew Side Channel project. So that year, if you look to the right of this picture, this shiny new large concrete intake was placed through the old dike. Remember I said the dike's on the left-hand side of the stream looking downstream? You can get a sense of the dike behind the concrete structure. The structure is the physical intake with a couple of gates, two large box culverts, and if you look past that little green sign, you just see a hint of water. That's the beginning of the Little Ashlew Side Channel. This is 1997. And what that water did over the next couple decades in a series of projects and different partners was just reconnect that maze of wetlands, ponds, and channels, which all historically would have flown through the Ashlew Flats. So just a comment on the Little Ashlew intake. A beautiful, robust concrete structure would not exactly be seen as a natural feature in the landscape. To some, it can be quite mildly disturbing. But remember where it sits. We're standing, this picture is taken standing on one of two logging bridges that crosses the Ashlew Creek, and we're on the main line logging road heading up the valley. Just upstream is a very large hydroelectric generating plant from the Ashlew Run of the River project. And those power lines that come from the plant head down the river crossing the Ashlew Flat. This concrete intake was effectively two large concrete culverts pass under a constructed river dike. Now, the gates at the entrance to those culverts, the black square structures, actually are set open at a certain amount But once that setting has been decided, it can stay set the same setting for years, and in fact it has. So it may not look pretty, but it works really well. No fuss, but what lies downstream of the intake is priceless. So this is a bird's eye view. If you look to the lower left, the little box, the green box, suggests the approximate location of the intake in and around there. And just the little green arrows as they spread across this big broad floodplain, that you're looking at the Ashlew Flats. And all the various channels have been reconnected in there, and various ponds have formed, beavers have colonized certain areas. The reality is, if you took one side of the flat and took a bearing and tried to walk it, it would be a long day through wild country full of things like Roosevelt elk, beavers, wolves, grizzly bears, black bears, cougars. This little piece of habitat is phenomenally productive for wildlife and salmon, and it is part of the benefits of the Little Ashlew Side Channel Restoration Project. So let's cycle through a number of shots of various habitat features for salmon in the Little Ashlew project. It is focused at pink salmon, but a lot of the habitat is used year-round by coho salmon, cutthroat trout, and steelhead trout. Chinook salmon use it, chum salmon use it in smaller numbers, but yes, it's a beautiful, diverse area and well worth having a look at in the future, if you can. So this is a surveyed sketch of a portion of the Little Ashlew project, roughly the northern half. If you look up to the far left of the slides, you'll see a notation of the intake gates where it starts, and then the channel actually effectively splits into the north and southern branch. This shows you the complexity of the northern branch of the Little Ashlew project. And just to give you a scale, you can see the scale at the bottom. We're talking a number of kilometers of channel forms and ponds and wetlands and marshes. Again, a very interesting and very biologically rich area that's important to salmon, but it's also important to many other species that like water and forests and wetlands and swamps. So just to summarize, in 1997, when the first flows were put down, a portion of the Little Ashlew Side Channel Complex, a stream assessment was done. Around 100 pink salmon were counted spawning in this area. So in 2013, the year of a really good pink salmon return to the watershed, something over 20,000 pink salmon were swimming and spawning in the now channels of the Little Ashlew. And there would be an additional probably 20,000 pink salmon in the Ashlew itself. A phenomenal year. So part of this story of the flats, as the value of the flats went up for salmon, things like grizzly bears moved down into this area for their annual feeding on pink salmon. Pink salmon are really important for grizzly bears to gain weight in the fall and winter successfully, and particularly for females to have good litters during the winter if they go in good condition. So the Ashlew Flats were recognized as a really productive area for grizzly bears. Interfor transferred some private lands they had held on the flats to the Squamish Nation, and the Squamish Nation designated it as a grizzly bear conservation area. All connected with the efforts starting back in 1997 to restore this area for salmon, and all through these partnerships, people talking to people, collaborating, other interests came together to protect it into the long term as a conservation area, which won't be logged in the future. This is a really good story. So the partners in this salmon habitat restoration have grown over the years. As I mentioned, Squamish Nation, the Squamish River Watershed Society has a relationship with an independent power producer. There's a little hydro plant was built in the interim upstream that contributes funds to maintain this habitat because of some of the impacts of their facilities that was done in the early 2000s. BC Ministry Environment deeply involved in this area through assessing grizzly bear use of this really unique patch of habitat. Squamish River Streamkeepers were a key group of volunteer folks walking around the wetlands and swamps and trying to provide the designers and the constructors, primarily DFO salmon enhancement professionals similar to Corbould Creek, but the streamkeepers provided all sorts of sketches where little connections could be made to rewater channels and wetlands. Really key information and a lot of work considering this is a wild place and you don't want to bump into some of the neighbors. So I guess my last comment, this diverse group has lots of ideas. They're full of dynamic individuals, but we agree on a couple things. Salmon are important, and we're going to try to make this area better for salmon, and so far it's been successful. And I think we all agree, talking to our provincial colleagues, none of us want to meet Big Bird when he's on the flats having his pink salmon dinner. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you. So we'll end our story of the Little Ashley Side Channel, watching the pinks in their spawning dance in channels big and small. So chum salmon are the other species in this clean stream group, but as we've discussed, there's different forms of certain species. Chum salmon is one of them. So the early timing fish tend to spawn in more mountain-fed runoff streams. Examples are some of the North Shore streams, such as Brothers Creek, have the chum spawn there relatively early, late September, October. Now, mid-timing populations spawn in surface flow rivers, but perhaps with a lake that holds a little bit of heat. Cheakamus River comes to mind, the Alouette River, the Stave River. Those are called mid-timing populations. Now, those two populations are included in the clean stream team. And we're going to talk about two rivers, stories about two rivers, the Brunette and Stave rivers, that had significant efforts at habitat restoration done on them over the last few decades. And I think they provide very interesting examples of what can be done for this group of species. So these two streams are marked on this map. The little yellow star indicates the watershed of the Brunette River. It's an extremely urban river, and it is more than urban, it's a city river with capital letters. The fact that salmon can even survive, and in some years thrive in the Brunette, is testimony to their incredible resilience and how much people care for them. And we'll talk about them a little bit more. The Stave River, shown by the red star, by contrast, is a big, brawling, mountain-fed stream, but it's been tamed by two large hydroelectric dams and has been generally pushed around by us for about 100 years. It's an industrial river, effectively. And yet, in both these examples, the chum salmon just refuse to give up. And in fact, they are quite inspiring. So let's take a lesson from these two rivers and their stories about chum salmon. So they should give us inspiration that the future can, in fact, be better than the past if we use a little bit of intelligence and put in a bit of effort. These species can recover in sometimes spectacular ways given half a chance. Okay, let's talk about this green and purple member of the Clean Stream team. Chum salmon are my very favorite salmon. And this salmon lives throughout our area in streams small and large. And this form we're talking about lives in the surface runoff, the rain-driven streams. So chum salmon, also known as Kita salmon, dog salmon. And let's begin by telling a story about one little urban river, the Brunette River in Burnaby, Vancouver, where their much-loved chum salmon have recovered, and we'll be talking about all the caring hands that helped them along the way on their recovery journey. So when we're finished this story, we'll move on to the second story about the electrifying Stave River. So I think the best way to describe the salmon recovery program in the Brunette River is for everyone to click on this link and quietly and slowly read this story and give some thought about the Brunette River. At the end, I'd suggest if you have any questions, then that's the time to discuss it. So let's carry on talking about chum salmon as part of the Clean Stream team, and we'll tell the story of the Stave River. So this is a big brawling mountain stream, comes out of the high mountain watershed, very large, big floods, but the chum salmon have access only to the first dam in the series, the Ruskin Dam, and I've showed it in red. It's approximately 3 kilometers upstream from the Fraser River, and only about half of that, 1.5 kilometers, has gravel beds useful for spawning salmon. However, even though this short section is all that is left after development of this river, the story of the recovery of the chum salmon of the Stave River is truly a tale worth telling. So we're looking at the Ruskin Dam on the lower Stave River. Effectively, this is what the chum salmon come up against as they migrate up from the Fraser. It probably takes them an hour swimming to get from the Fraser to this dam, and that's the end of the line. So from here down about 1.5 kilometers, there is gravel on the stream bed, useful for spawning salmon, or a portion of it is anyway. So if you think about it, when you dam a river and create a reservoir or a lake, all the streams that would have fed gravel into the stream now feed gravel into the reservoir. That gravel does not wash downstream. So historically, the Stave River had another fishing pass about 10 kilometers up. So all the tributaries below that dam would have naturally replenished the gravel in the lower Stave River. That does not happen. So dams stop the movement of gravel. So what does that mean? Well, every time we get a fall flood and gravel moves in the stream bed below the dam, the smaller gravel, the sands move first, the smaller gravel moves next. And depending on the magnitude of the flood, although the lakes moderate the floods in the Stave River, the gravel moves downstream. So over time, what's left is coarse gravel that the floods can't move. In the Stave, that might be 6 inches to a foot in some places. That's too big for a chum salmon to spawn. So it's quite common in hydro dam rivers to find the river quite coarse and not useful for spawning below the dam. Now this may have occurred over decades. This dam was built in 1930, just for example. So the other thing to consider is the water. If you look off to the right, you see some white water. That's water that's gone through the hydroelectric turbines. And generally, the managers of the dam, we'll call them knob turners that turn the various dials and switches that manage the dam, they want to put the water through the turbines. It will come over the dam only in the biggest floods. So most of the time it goes to the turbines. Well, the turbines are generating electricity. So if you think about it, if we don't need electricity, it's likely they're not releasing water. So again, the river doesn't have a natural flow. Sometimes it's flowing high. Oh, we have a high electricity demand. Oh, sometimes it's almost not flowing at all. Oh, we have a low electricity demand. So we'll talk about that in the next slides. So as we discussed, the Ruskin Hydroelectric Dam was completed in 1930. So for the next 60 years, the only time water was released from Ruskin Dam was when us humans needed some electricity. Now this did change in 1990. But what it meant, as we've said, the river would flow very high typically during the day when we had a lot of stuff running. But when we went to bed at night, very often the river went right down and most of the gravel bars were exposed. And many of those gravel bars were where the salmon had been trying to lay their eggs during the day. And this is a problem for the eggs if they were exposed for too long a period. So this was the nature of the Stave River. A lot of it was hidden because the very lowest flows often occurred in the middle of the night. But it definitely impacted the Stave River salmon runs, chum salmon in particularly, for that 60 years. So as we discussed in the previous slide, around 1990, a whole bunch of things changed for chum salmon. And it was effectively the conflict of high water, low water between BC Hydro and other users of the river, regulators, came to a point where BC Hydro decided it was to their interest to begin a process to negotiate how to run the hydroelectric dam that balanced the needs of salmon, recreation, other things that people valued, and electrical generation. So this was a very positive thing starting around 1990. So out of that discussion came an agreement around the 1990. And what it was effectively, during the period the fish were physically spawning, they started in September and they went to roughly December, the BC Hydro agreed to keep the base flow, the river, at a steady flow. And if there was floods, it would go higher, which they didn't control floods, but they wouldn't let it go below a certain minimum level. They had a gauge on the back of the dam, a number of an elevation. It might have been 1.67 meters geodetic. So they managed it very precisely not to go below that level. And that was really, really important. That was the beginning of the restoration of the chum salmon of the Stave River. Because once the water was guaranteed a minimum flow, other groups could look at doing physical works to recontour the riverbed and know if they brought fish into spawning areas, they would not go dry that night because we had a minimum flow agreement. So all the parties were very keen on this agreement. They were working together well. And from about 1990 to 1995, an awful lot of physical works were done on the Stave River, all parties contributing, and it resulted in quite a spectacular story ending. Okay, this is an aerial view of the spawnable reach of the Stave River. If you look at the yellow circle is the Ruskin Dam. So that's the end of the line, and the red line is roughly as far downstream as chum salmon spawn. The gravel quality declines. It gets quite fine and silty and sandy. And also the effect of the Fraser tide means it doesn't really flow as much of the day needed to keep that oxygen moving past the reds. So effectively, it's just that one little reach of the stream where all the chum salmon have to spawn. Now again, the dam operators kept a minimum level. And as I've talked about, the dam spills water, and you can see it's quite narrow upstream, and then it fans out. So the gravel upstream tend to be quite coarse because the velocity of the river during floods is higher, and the finer gravels ended up down here, just at the base of the red line, down toward the red line. So one of the restoration strategies was to regrade the river in the key reach for spawning, creating a number of side channels, but also moving some finer gravel and mixing it with coarser gravel in the upstream. So we hauled gravel from the bottom, moved it to the top, recontoured it, knowing that that gravel will wash down over years. But perhaps in 20 or 30 years, the process would be done again as a long-term management strategy. So when I use that word recontouring or moving gravel and talking about these various side channels being excavated, we're talking about a very large landscape. You get a sense, hundreds of meters wide, the river in this reach, and this is all heavy equipment. So bulldozers, excavators, Volvo 4x4, gravel trucks. Just a lot of physical work to move heavy material gravel from the bottom end of the reach to the top, or in the case of the excavator, excavate channels through high and dry gravel bars and creating these side channels that will be useful for spawning. So typically the work would have occurred in the late summer, fall, when the dam could be held and water releases could be dropped so we could do the work, and had to end by the time the fish came. So sometime just around mid-September, just a little bit later, the very first fish started to come into the river and the work ended. So really there was about a month of work at maximum, and it was done over 5 years. But in those 5 years, something like 150,000 square meters of spawning area was restored. And this could support more than 200,000 additional chum salmon if they used it and if they came back. And that was the question. So we'll see how the story turned out. This is a shot taken roughly soon after 1995 when the in-stream work had been completed. And it's an interesting slide. If you look at the color of the gravel, the lighter colored areas have been disturbed. If you look at the big bar on the lower right, it's much darker. That's undisturbed gravel. But if you look at the channels in the middle of the slide, those were all recontoured. And you can sort of see the shape of these channels that were cut through these old bars and gravel moved around. These are very large channels. The other thing to note is I talked about the upper pit example and the Ashlew example where the intake restricts flows into the channels during flood events, the pipelines. Well, in this case, if you notice the top end of the channels in the center, almost all of them have a narrowing at the top end. There's no gravel moving really in the channel because of the dam, but it restricts the energy of the water moving over the spawning grounds during a flood, those narrow top ends. Anyway, it gives you a sense of the size of the landscape that was moved and changed, hopefully to benefit salmon. So as we've discussed, in the 1930s, salmon, particularly chum salmon, are restricted to 1.5 kilometers. You can see the dam at the upper right piece of this slide. 1.5 kilometers, largely in the area that shows this light colored gravel that's been recently disturbed. Now in the 1940s, within a decade of dam construction, there was still up to 5,000 salmon still managing to spawn in the lower Stave River. In 1998, and that was a year of particularly good marine conditions, but still, if nothing goes to sea, nothing comes back. There must have been a phenomenal output of chum salmon fry over the previous number of years. So in 1998, the estimated spawning run for chum salmon in the Stave River was 600,000 fish. And this remains the historical record. Now, observing that run, every pool was black with salmon. Every patch of gravel was covered with spawning salmon. And even those fish in the pools were looking a little beat up because they were waiting their turn. Every patch of exposed gravel, the right size, was being used. That was a year that was truly memorable and truly inspiring on the Stave River. Now, all the twists and turns I haven't gotten into on how this project came about. But if you see that link on the bottom of the slide, have a click. It's a story. It talks about the past. It talks about the people. It talks about the work. And it talks about the results of this work on the Stave River. It's well worth your time to read. So in summary, in lesson 2, we looked at these group of salmon, pinks, sockeye, and chum salmon, certain forms of chum and sockeye, that use primarily these flowing channels, the main channels of the river and the larger side channels of that river that are more exposed to flood events. Therefore, the techniques that were used were to provide access to more stable spawning habitats. And the tools applied to each population were somewhat different. In the upper pit, providing that stable controlled flow in a side channel off on the edge of the floodplain, very similar to the example we used in the Ashley River. One was for sockeye, one was for pink salmon, but effectively the same technique was used. When we looked at the Brunette River chum salmon, a couple techniques. Aside from reintroducing chum salmon to the watershed, it really was providing access to existing habitats by overcoming various barriers, culverts, weirs, dams that had been built in the previous century. Effectively, the stable spawning grounds still existed in the Brunette River. Chum salmon just could not get to them. So again, the tools used from the toolbox in that case were somewhat different. And then we have the Stave River. A very stable flow below 2 hydroelectric dams and reservoirs, but of lack of quality spawning gravels, because it had coarsened over the decades since the dams had been built and gravel recruitment had ceased. And also the flows were not being managed to benefit spawning salmon, either too high or too low. So again, the tools used, stabilizing the flow and just making the gravel the appropriate size and accessible to spawning chum salmon, was what was used from the toolbox to a very effective outcome on the Stave River. So again, the messages of lesson 2 were, these are all the same species, but each population in each watershed will have different conditions, and a thoughtful discussion needs to occur on what tools might be applied if the goal is to see an improvement in salmon populations in those watersheds. It's not all the same. It is very personal. Hopefully you enjoyed lesson 2. So we have provided a list of references, and there's a link to the various reports we've talked about during this lesson 2. So the first reference is a link to the fish habitat rehabilitation procedures and directs the students to read section 7, pages 6 to 20. The second reference is a story about the Squamish River pink salmon recovery efforts. Reference 3 is a story on the recovery of Brunette River chum salmon and some of the efforts that led to this urban stream salmon success story. Reference 4 is a technical review of the status of the Stave River chum salmon over the period when fish culture, flow regulation, and habitat restoration was undertaken in an attempt to rebuild this chum salmon population in a watershed highly impacted by hydroelectric development in the early 20th century. And the final reference 5, is a story about the Stave River, its history, and how recent restoration efforts by a whole range of people and groups have led to a remarkable recovery of its chum salmon population. I hope you enjoyed lesson 2.